Well, we just wrapped up day leader visiting President Trump at Mar-a-Lago. Yesterday it was Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Today, it is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Trump had summoned Netanyahu here to Palm Beach. By the way, it's the fifth time that the Israeli Prime Minister has visited President Trump since he returned to office. There's a little bit of sticking point. As you remember, all 20 living Israeli hostages were released from Hamas captivity in Gaza 2 months ago. And now the Trump administration is putting a little pressure on Netanyahu, saying they want to see more effort go toward reconstruction in Gaza. But Prime Minister Netanyahu wanted to make clear that Hamas is still not disarmed, something that President Trump heard, and he says Hamas must disarm quickly, or, quote, there will be hell to pay. And the Israeli Prime Minister also brought to Palm Beach a fresh warning about Iran, saying it is moving ahead with both its ballistic missile program and its nuclear program at other sites that were not hit during Operation Midnight Hammers. We all remember over the summer when those B-2 bombers destroyed Iran's nuclear sites, as well as those 30 Tomahawk missiles fired from the USS Georgia, the submarine in the Arabian Sea. This is all the backdrop of the meeting between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. It was very cordial. We heard both men at a press conference after their meetings. The Israeli Prime Minister offered President Trump the Israeli prize, the highest civilian honor. President Trump says he wants to see a pardon for the Israeli Prime Minister. And we also had heard some other news. President Trump, when the Prime Minister arrived, was asked about a mysterious strike in Venezuela last week, and President Trump acknowledged the U.S. was involved. Now, when a reporter followed up and says, was this the U.S. military? Was this the CIA? President Trump wouldn't say. He just acknowledged U.S. fingerprints were all over this operation. Of course, this is about the oil in Venezuela. It's about the drug boats. President Trump said this was a facility, a warehouse where Nicolas Maduro, the leader of Venezuela, stores oil and where those drug boats launch from. So that's something to watch. We also heard today from Russian President Vladimir Putin, or at least through the Kremlin, saying that the Russians are accusing Ukraine of launching an attack on Putin's residence. President Trump was asked about that before he and Netanyahu went into Mar-a-Lago for their meetings. President Trump said he had just spoken to Vladimir Putin today about it. This was the second phone call that Trump has had with Putin. He spoke to him before Zelensky arrived and then again this morning. And President Trump, when he was asked about the strike, said he was very angry about it. He said this is why he didn't approve Tomahawk cruise missiles for Ukraine some months ago. Now, almost immediately, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky took to X and denied any involvement, called the story a complete fabrication. So for the past 2 days, we've had two different world leaders in Palm Beach. In fact, just arriving here last night, it was almost surreal in Palm Beach International Airport. Is really living up to his name when you saw the Ukrainian presidential aircraft parked next to the wing of Zion. That's the Israeli Prime Minister's aircraft. So two visits by two world leaders here to Mar-a-Lago. President Trump, before he gets onto affordability, really tackling some major challenges in the foreign policy realm. He's trying to end Russia's war on Ukraine. Wants to get to a ceasefire, says they're 95% of the way there, although it's very notable, guys, that we have not heard a thing from the Russians and Vladimir Putin about wanting to end the war. In fact, one of the accusations from Zelensky today denying that story about targeting Putin's home is that he thinks Putin is just going to use this story as a fabrication and impetus, if you will, to launch more attacks on Ukraine. You saw the horrific devastation in Ukraine's capital late last week. Some 500 drones and dozens of ballistic and cruise missiles were launched at Ukraine's capital, targeting residential areas. And this is a war that President Trump says he wants to end. He's acknowledged it's very difficult. But he also says he wouldn't be meeting with Zelensky if he didn't think both sides were close. President Trump used the word 90 to 95%. That's how close they are. And also with the visit from Israel's prime minister, it's very clear the White House wants to see some things happening in Gaza. But it's notable, not only is Hamas not disarmed, it's still running the Gaza Strip. And remember, it's just a few weeks ago that the Israeli forces droned a Hamas commander who they say was one of the chief architects of the October 7th attacks. They accused him of violating the ceasefire. Hamas said Israel was violating the ceasefire. So a lot of back and forth. And, of course, Israeli forces still occupy parts of the Gaza Strip. should things move to phase 2 of the ceasefire agreement. Part of that agreement with phase 2 is for Israeli forces to completely leave the Gaza Strip. That doesn't appear that's happening anytime soon. Another major sticking point is what happened to this international stabilization force. And we heard for the last 2 months that there would be Arab forces. Indonesia had pledged that, or signaled that they were willing to put some troops in. The Israelis don't want any Turkish forces in. So that seems to be a sticking point right now because Hamas is still in control. They have not disarmed. And on a touching note today, the Israeli Prime Minister mentioned that there's still one deceased member of the Israeli Defense Forces that is still in captivity. He wants to see those remains returned as part of the ceasefire agreement, that all hostages are returned, both dead and alive. And while it was great news back in October, as everybody remembers, when President Trump flew to Israel, spoke at the Knesset after the last 20 living Israeli hostages were released, there's still a lone soldier whose body remains in Hamas captivity, and Israel wants him back. In fact, his family flew on the wing of Zion, Netanyahu's plane, here to Palm Beach. And so major peace efforts underway. Let's not forget, we heard recently from Trump's top economic advisor, Kevin Hassett, that they're planning on spending a week down at Mar-a-Lago down here in Palm Beach to tackle the affordability, what some people call a crisis. And so expect things to shift from the foreign policy realm to domestic policy because affordability, the buzzword when it comes to the midterms next year.